can start with the basics, and that is this, is that in Florida, we have a form of contract called a FAR bar contract. You've probably heard
Very
that term
familiar,
before, yeah?
yes.
So FAR is Florida Association of Realtors. BAR is the Florida Bar. The realtors and the lawyers got together and came up with a standard FAR bar contract. And you might say, well, all FAR bar contracts are the same. And the answer is no, not really, because they're always updating the form. So occasionally I'll see somebody that's using a FAR bar contract that's 3 years old and 3 versions ago. So there are, if you're working with a FAR bar contract, you want to make sure that you're working with the latest version of that FAR bar contract. So beyond that, the most commonly used FAR bar contract is what's called an as-is contract.
Yes.
You know that
I've
term,
seen
right?
those, yes.
So you want to explain to me what an as-is contract?
Isn't an as-is contract meaning you are, lack of a better way to say, taking the property as is with little contingencies?
It would be, I would describe an as-is contract as this, is that in most of the contracts that people are using to buy and sell homes in Florida, state of Florida, are FAR bar as-is contracts. As is means that prior to closing, the seller is not going to be obligated to pay for any repairs, termite repairs, you name it. The sellers are buying it as is. But we need to qualify that because all these contracts always have a inspection contingency.
Yes.
So even after the contract is signed, the buyer has a period of time, typically 15 days, to go out and get inspections done. And if there are problems, then the buyer can back out of that contract and get their good faith deposit back.
Yes.
So realistically, the seller is not obligated to pay for any repairs, and yet if they sign a contract with the buyer and the buyer goes out and has an inspection done and finds out, oh, there's a problem with the grounding in the electrical panel and there's this other little problem, well, realistically, they're going to go back to the seller and say, look, you need to fix these things. You're not obligated to fix these things under the contract, but we're asking you to fix them. And usually the seller says, fine, I will fix those things for you. And the reason for that is that now that the seller is on notice that there's a ground issue with the electrical panel,
Or like a defect.
a little defect in the plumbing, now that the seller's on notice, if this buyer backs out, the seller would be obligated to tell the next buyer, hey, by the way, there's two problems: problem with the electrical problem with the plumbing,
Right.
and who's going to buy it under those conditions?
Right.
So they just have to fix it for the next buyer down the road anyway.
I also think about too, I know this is more so on like the buyer end, but sometimes too, the buyers have issues with getting a loan because mortgage companies now, they are very strict about like roofs and all these different things. So depending on the buyer, it could be hard for a seller, because a lot of people need mortgages to buy homes.
That is an excellent point, Alexis. Thank you for bringing that to my
Yeah.
attention. So for the buyer to go out and borrow money to buy this house, their lender is going to require that a 4-point inspection be done and probably even a wind mitigation inspection be done. So that when the buyer has a 4-point inspection done, which is electrical, air conditioning, plumbing, and roofing. And so that if there's a problem with that 4-point inspection, then the buyer is not going to be able to borrow money and the deal is off.
Right.
Once again, the seller might step in and say, okay, I didn't realize there were these problems. I need to fix problems 1, 2, and 3 in order to get a 4-point inspection that will pass the lender. And that's just kind of the fact of life these days.
Yeah, unless obviously you have a cash buyer, which of course that's a completely different story. But, a lot of times people are buying and selling their home to buy another one or, getting loans in order to purchase a new home.
Yeah. So that these FAR bar contracts that we've been talking about, and the most commonly used one is the as-is contract. They have at least a couple of contingencies in there. One contingency is a 15-day, it's a fill in the blank, but typically it's 15 days for the buyer to go out and have whatever inspections they want to have done and cancel the contract for any reason during that 15 days. I call it a free look period. Then the other contingency is that the contingent on the buyer getting financing. If
Right.
for some reason the buyer is not able to get financing, then it's also a basis for the buyer to cancel their contract and get their good faith deposit back. It's a little bit more in the gray area for that, for the financing contingency. Over the years, occasionally I'll see a buyer that wants to slip in a contingency, and it's that the buyer would say, I want to put this in this contract that is contingent on me, the buyer, selling my existing home.
Oh.
And most sellers are not going to put up with that
No.
these days. So that's pretty rare that that's going to be
Yeah.
acceptable to people.
Yeah. 'Cause as a seller, that would not be beneficial to them.
It's just too many unknowns there.
Right.
Yeah. So
And the time frame,
yeah.
even too, who knows?
So from a buyer's perspective, I can understand, people want to sell their existing home and move into a bigger home, and they can't do both. They got to sell their old home to get it done. So I'm not quite sure how they get that resolved, but
Yeah.
it's a common issue for buyers these days that they got to sell their existing home.
And isn't another issue too now where, because of the insurance issues in Florida, when you're trying to get a loan, the mortgage companies too are looking at insurance.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, just the
If
flat
you're in a
out
flood zone or
Yeah.
something like that.
Exactly. And the cost of insurance, and yes, are you in a flood zone and that kind of thing. So that's kind of thing about the contracts. And so I have a nice computer program. I mean, back in the day, I used to literally take out a contract and it came with carbon parts, stick it to the typewriter and type in the blanks. But we have a much better process for it these days. We can continue to talk about it after the break. Hey, folks. So we're talking about the standard FAR bar as is contract. FAR is the Florida Association of Realtors. BAR is the Florida Bar. The lawyers and the realtors got together and created this form of a contract called a FAR bar contract. There are different types of FAR bar contracts, but the most commonly used one is an as-is contract. And when you do an as-is, it means that prior to closing, the seller is not obligated to pay for any repairs. Got that part right?
Got it.
Now, one thing I want to clear about that is that as is, the seller is still obligated to disclose known defects in the property. So just because it's an as-is contract as a seller, doesn't mean you don't have to tell a buyer the problems with the known problem with the property. You're still obligated to do that.
Yes.
So we're talking about an as-is contract. Now, one of the other things is that people often, when I'm doing a contract for them, whether they're a buyer or the seller, they'll say, what are my closing costs going to be? How much is it going to cost to close this transaction? And that is the FAR bar contract has a standard language in there as to who pays what closing costs.
Yes.
And the biggest two closing costs typically are the doc stamps on the deed and the title insurance. The standard FAR bar contract says that's a seller expense. And then the buyer pays all costs associated with borrowing money. If the buyer was an all-cash buyer, there's no borrowing costs, loan fees, etc. The buyer's closing costs would be minimal, less than $500. But if you're borrowing money from a bank, it's very expensive to borrow money from a bank or a lender. And by the time you're buying a house that's a few $100,000, your loan closing costs might be $6,000 to $9,000.
Right.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot.
And that's why it's expensive to borrow money.
It is expensive to borrow money.
Yeah. I know that you and your husband Chris are looking to buy your first home.
We are.
Hopefully 2025 will be the year.
I hope so.
I'm sure I've told you, but I'll tell the listeners out there too that the very first home that I bought in 1982 here in Orlando, we assumed an FHA mortgage. We felt we were doing really, really great, assuming a mortgage that was at 16.5% interest. And we thought we were doing good.
Yes.
So people, I'm not saying it's good or fair, we should be going back there, but compared to what they are now, that's pretty outrageous.
And one thing too is like obviously during COVID, there was that stretch of time where the interest rates were like 2%,
Yeah.
like 2 to 3%. And so because so many people took advantage of that opportunity
Yes.
where they got those low interest rates, now people like me and Chris that are in the position to buy, we're like, man, that's more than double what those people have
I
on
know.
theirs.
It's
Not compared to 16, but
well, it's a whole it's creating a people are stuck in the homes they're
I
in.
was just about to say that, but the disadvantage is those people definitely feel stuck where they're at.
Exactly. Who
Yeah.
wants to give up a 3% mortgage to go out and pay 6 or 7%?
And then also too, people are budgeting around that, like their monthly mortgage payment, and
Yes.
they have to account for that. And so they're like, well, if I go somewhere else, it's going to be this much more for the same value of like a house somewhere else.
I only learned a month ago that the interest rate for home mortgages is not directly tied to what the Federal Reserve interest rate is. When
That's
they were
right.
talking about the Federal Reserve rate coming down over the last few months, you're thinking, oh, great. That automatically means mortgage interest rates are coming down. No, that has
No.
not been the case.
And
I'm not keeping up with it. But are you keeping up with the mortgage rates right now?
I keep up with them pretty often just because of, kind of being on the hunt and preparing. But one thing a lot of people my age specifically are doing is people not, and I know you and I have the same opinion where this isn't the best route to go, but just to be able to get into a home, people are buying new construction.
Yeah.
Because the new construction communities are offering for them like incentives
Right.
and rate buy downs. And
Yes.
their rates are much lower than what you would get with a conventional or FHA. But the disadvantage is, you're
Yeah, you know that I listen to Clark Howard, the consumer warrior. He's been doing radio for over 40 years. He's been
Yes.
a little longer than I am. And
Yes.
I listen to Clark Howard on a podcast every day, Clark Howard, the consumer warrior. And he said over the last 6 months that this is the first time in his 40-year career where he said buying a new house may be a better deal than buying an existing
Yep.
house, a used house.
That's what I've been hearing too.
And it's same thing that applies to a car. It's from a financial perspective, it is much better to buy a used car than it is to buy a brand new car.
Right.
And simply because of what you're talking about is that when new home construction sellers, they're paying discount points to get you into a mortgage rate that's more acceptable to you.
Exactly. And so a lot of people my age, obviously because of, it's expensive to live. We all know that.
Yeah.
That's why people are doing it, because they can get into a home, or at least they're owning something, not renting something.
Right.
May not be their first priority, but that's what they're using to get their foot in the door, to at least have something and have, then can buy something else later on.
Well, Clark also said that historically, when you buy a home, you have to own it for at least 5 years to even break even on it when you sell, because it's 10% in and 10% out.
Okay.
When you consider loan closing costs and realtor fees to sell it, etc. So you may buy it for $200 and sell it for $250, but that's not going to be a profit deal for you.
Right.
When you add in what it costs to get in and what it costs to get out.
Yes.
So the thing about the new construction is that if you're in a new development, there are people, it's going to be hard to sell your home when the time comes.
That's what I feel.
Yeah.
Is my concern always with that is the resale.
Exactly.
Because people are aware and they're like, well, the build quality, may not be as good, or, and every home, no matter what, used or new, they all have issues. But, that was always my concern.
Well, I'm coming at it from a little bit different angle, and that is that if you're in a development where they're still building homes, there's still vacant lots, and somebody wants to live in that community, why are they going to buy your used house? I'll buy something brand new down the street.
Right.
There are plenty of options down the street. So it's a challenge, but I'm still a believer in used homes, and I hope it comes true for you and Christopher this year that you guys can get a home of your own.
Yes, I hope so too.
Hey, folks, we want